The first thing I saw was the reflection of red and blue lights dancing across the water of my lake. It was just after sunset, and the surface of Lake Norman looked like polished glass stretching out beyond my dock. I was standing on a ladder replacing a weathered section of railing that had been there since my wife, Claire, was still alive. The smell of fresh-cut cedar mixed with the cool lake air, and for a few seconds I honestly thought somebody down the shoreline had called for help. Then I noticed the patrol cars slowing down in front of my gate. That was strange. Even stranger, both units stopped directly outside my property. Something was wrong. I climbed down from the ladder and wiped sawdust from my hands with an old shop rag. Through the trees, I could see a crowd gathering near the entrance to Whitaker Point Estate. Several residents from the subdivision next door were standing there holding phones. A few were recording. One woman stood in front of everyone else, like she was hosting her own television show. Maribel Vickers, the acting president of Silverglass Shores HOA. She was wearing oversized sunglasses even though the sun had already disappeared behind the trees, and she had her phone pointed toward the gate while speaking into the camera with that polished smile she always used when she wanted people to think she was the smartest person in the room. Then I heard the words that made me stop walking. The trespasser is still inside the property. Trespasser. That got my attention, because the property she was talking about was mine. 11 acres. Private deed. Paid taxes every year. Owned by my family since 1974. And apparently, according to Maribel, I was trespassing on it. Big mistake. I started walking toward the gate. The gravel crunched under my boots while the patrol car doors opened almost at the same time. Maribel immediately turned toward the deputies and pointed in my direction like she had just captured some dangerous criminal. That's him, she announced. He's been occupying HOA-controlled lakefront property and refusing lawful requests to leave. Several people behind her nodded. A few looked confused. One older couple looked nervous. I didn't say anything. I just kept walking. Years earlier, when I wore a sheriff's badge every day, I learned something important. The loudest person in a conflict is usually the one who knows the least. So I let her talk. Maribel kept going. She claimed residents felt unsafe. She claimed I had ignored HOA authority. She claimed I was preventing access to community property. Every sentence sounded more confident than the last. Every sentence was wrong. Then one of the deputies stepped fully into view. Deputy Nolan Price. For a second I almost laughed. 20 years ago, Nolan was a nervous rookie who could barely finish a traffic stop without calling for advice. I trained him myself. I taught him report writing, evidence preservation, and one lesson he always remembered. Never assume the first story you hear is the truth. He looked at me. I looked at him. The entire crowd went quiet. Maribel was still smiling because she thought she had already won. She thought the handcuffs were coming for me. She had no idea what was about to happen. I folded the rag into my back pocket and gave Nolan a small nod. Evening, Deputy Price. He stared for half a second. Then his eyes shifted from me to the estate behind me, to the gate, to Maribel holding her phone. The smile vanished from his face. Ma'am, he said carefully, did you just report Sheriff Whitaker as a trespasser? The silence that followed was so complete I could hear water tapping softly against the dock almost 200 yards away. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. And for the first time all evening, Maribel looked uncertain. Now, if you've ever watched somebody walk confidently into a situation without realizing they brought the evidence against themselves, you already know why this story stayed with me. And if you're listening from a small town, a lake community, or anywhere people take property rights seriously, pull up a chair and stay a while. What happened next taught an entire neighborhood the difference between authority and ownership. Let me back up for a minute, because none of what happened at that gate makes sense unless you understand what that property meant to me. Most people looked at Whitaker Point Estate and saw dollar signs. Realtors loved throwing around numbers. $8 million. Prime lakefront acreage. Private shoreline. Development potential. They said those words like they were describing a stock portfolio. I never saw it that way. Not once. To me, it was home. My father bought the land in 1974 when Lake Norman still felt wild. Back then there were no luxury subdivisions, no golf carts, no homeowners association newsletters showing smiling families holding wine glasses on perfectly trimmed lawns. There was just water, trees, and a gravel road that turned into mud every time it rained. My father loved it immediately. So did my mother. Years later, when I married Claire, She loved it too. That place became our whole world. We built memories there. The house sitting on that point was not some giant mansion built to impress strangers. It was a sturdy lake house that grew one room at a time over 4 decades. Every addition had a story behind it. Every board had fingerprints on it. Every corner carried a memory. That mattered. Claire especially loved the dock. During summer evenings, she would sit at the end of it with a glass of iced tea while the sun disappeared behind the trees across the water. She always said sunsets looked slower from there. I used to laugh when she said that. Then one day I realized she was right. Life moved slower at the lake. Better too. When I retired from the sheriff's office after 34 years, that dock became my favorite place in the world. Some mornings I would sit there before sunrise listening to fish jump near the shoreline while fog drifted across the water like smoke. No sirens. No radios. No emergency calls. Just peace. I earned that peace. Then Claire suffered a stroke. Everything changed after that. The woman who used to walk the shoreline every evening suddenly needed help climbing 3 steps. The woman who never sat still needed a cane. Then a walker. Then more help than either of us wanted to admit. We adapted. We always did. I widened doorways. I added railings. I built ramps. I spent more time learning about physical therapy than I ever expected. For 6 years, that lake house became something different. It became a place for healing. Every improvement I made had one goal: keep Claire home. The lake helped. Some evenings she would sit on the porch and watch the water for an hour without saying a word. Those were good days. Then there were fewer good days. Eventually, there were none. Claire passed away 18 months before the night Maribel called the deputies. The silence afterward was harder than anything I experienced wearing a badge. Harder than crime scenes. Harder than emergencies. Harder than funerals. Because the silence stayed. Every room reminded me of her. Every path around the property reminded me of her. Every sunrise reminded me she was gone. Still, I never considered selling. Not even once. People asked all the time. Developers called. Investors mailed letters. Realtors knocked on the gate. One man offered cash before even seeing the inside of the house. I told all of them the same thing. Not interested. Most accepted the answer. Some did not. Around that same time, Silverglass Shores started appearing beyond the tree line next door. Bulldozers arrived first. Then construction crews. Then rows of expensive houses. Every month another section seemed to appear. New roads. New signs. New promises. The advertisements talked about exclusive lake living. The brochures talked about luxury. The sales videos talked about lifestyle. I paid little attention. At first. Then one afternoon, an envelope appeared in my mailbox with the Silverglass Shores logo stamped across the front. Inside was a welcome packet addressed to me. That was strange, because I did not live in Silverglass Shores. Not even close. And that envelope was the first small clue that somebody was about to make a very expensive mistake. That welcome packet sat on my kitchen table for 2 days before I opened it. At first, I assumed it had been delivered to the wrong address because my property was not inside Silverglass Shores and never had been. The subdivision ended well before my land began. The county maps were clear. The deeds were clear. Reality was clear. Then I opened the envelope. Inside was a glossy brochure showing smiling families standing beside a lake dock that looked strangely familiar. There was a reason for that. It was my dock. The same dock Claire loved. The same dock sitting on my property. The same dock I paid taxes on every single year. Somebody had used a photograph of it in their marketing material. That caught my attention. The brochure talked about exclusive waterfront amenities, future recreational opportunities, enhanced community value, and premium lake access experiences. Lots of fancy words. Very few details. Tucked behind the brochure was a letter welcoming me to the Silverglass Shores Community Partnership Program. According to the letter, all neighboring property owners were expected to cooperate with new lakefront initiatives that would benefit residents and strengthen community standards. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was ridiculous. Nobody had ever asked permission. A week later, I met Maribel Vickers for the first time. I was walking down toward my boathouse when a white SUV rolled slowly along Whitaker Lane and stopped near my gate. A woman stepped out carrying a leather folder and wearing the kind of smile that felt rehearsed. She introduced herself like she was arriving for a business meeting. "Mr. Whitaker, I am Maribel Vickers, acting president of Silverglass Shores." I nodded. "Can I help you?" She glanced past me toward the lake. Not at me. At the property. Beautiful location, she said. The residents absolutely love the view. Something about the way she said residents bothered me, as if they already owned part of it. We stood there for several minutes while she explained her vision for the community. She talked about harmony. She talked about modernization. She talked about shared resources. Then she finally got to the real point. We would like to discuss access. There it was. I asked her what kind of access. She smiled wider. The dock. The shoreline. Potential community events. Nothing unreasonable. Nothing unreasonable. Those words tend to mean trouble. I told her the property was private. I told her there were no recorded easements. I told her the dock was not a public facility. The conversation should have ended there. Instead, she tilted her head and gave me a look I had seen many times during my law enforcement career. It was the look people gave when they thought rules only applied to other people. Mr. Whitaker, she said softly, sometimes cooperation benefits everyone. I answered with the truth. Sometimes it does. Then I pointed toward the county road. But ownership still matters. Her smile faded for the first time. Just for a second. Then it returned. She thanked me for my time, got back into her SUV, and drove away. Most people would have taken that conversation as a polite rejection and moved on. Maribel did not. Over the next month, more things started happening. Residents appeared near my shoreline taking photographs. Golf carts slowed down near the gate. People asked questions about future lake access as though some announcement had already been made. One retired couple even thanked me for supporting the community marina project. I had no idea what they were talking about. That was when I realized something important. Maribel was telling one story to me and a completely different story to everyone else. And the gap between those two stories was getting wider every day. The first real sign that Maribel had stopped treating this like a disagreement and started treating it like a campaign showed up on a Tuesday morning. I stepped outside with my coffee just after sunrise and found 3 bright orange survey stakes driven into the grass beside my gate. They had not been there the night before. Nobody had asked permission. Nobody had left a note. Somebody had simply decided they belonged there. That bothered me. I walked down the driveway and pulled one out of the ground. Then another. Then the third. Each one had a small ribbon tied near the top with the words Community Access written in black marker. Community Access. On my property. That was new. Around 10 o'clock, a convoy of golf carts rolled up Whitaker Lane. 4 carts. 8 people. Clipboards everywhere. The group stopped near my entrance and began taking measurements as if they were preparing for a construction project. One man pointed toward my shoreline. Another pointed toward the dock. A woman was sketching something on a legal pad. Nobody seemed concerned that they were standing on private land. I walked over and asked a simple question. Can I help you folks? They all looked at Maribel before answering. That told me everything. She stepped forward wearing a cream-colored outfit that probably cost more than my truck payment and smiled like we were old friends. Just conducting a safety review for future recreational planning. I looked around. Future recreational planning for who? Her smile tightened. The community. There it was again. The community. Always the community. Never the owner. I reminded her the property was private. I reminded her there were no access rights. I reminded her she had already been told that. Maribel listened patiently, nodded twice, and then did something interesting. She took out her phone and started recording me. Not the land. Not the shoreline. Me. Please continue, she said. Transparency is important. That was the moment I realized she was not interested in facts. She was interested in creating a story where she was protecting residents from a difficult old landowner. A story where ownership was less important than popularity. A story she hoped people would believe. She picked the wrong audience. A few days later, another surprise arrived. This time, it was a formal notice taped directly to my gate. The document claimed Whitaker Point was interfering with community development objectives and requested immediate cooperation with ongoing lakefront planning initiatives. It looked official. Lots of bold lettering. Lots of legal-sounding language. Very little authority. I read it twice and laughed. Then I photographed it and filed it away. Years in law enforcement taught me something valuable. Never throw away evidence. Especially when people hand it to you for free. The situation escalated the following weekend. I was repairing a section of fence near the shoreline when I heard voices coming from the dock. Not near the dock. On the dock. I walked down the hill and found 6 Silverglass Shores residents standing there taking pictures. One couple was discussing where community kayak racks might fit. Another Resident was explaining how perfect the location would be for neighborhood events. None of them seemed hostile. Most looked genuinely confused when I introduced myself as the owner. One man blinked at me and said, "Wait, we were told this was becoming shared property." Another woman pointed toward the subdivision and added, "The sales presentation said access was already being finalized." That stopped me cold, because those people were not lying. They honestly believed it. Somebody had sold them a promise that was never theirs to make. And whoever made that promise was about to create a very expensive problem for everyone involved. What bothered me most was not that Maribel was pushing boundaries. I had dealt with difficult people my entire career. What bothered me was that ordinary homeowners were getting pulled into something they did not understand. Most of them were not trying to take my property. Most of them honestly believed what they had been told. That made the situation a lot more dangerous. Confusion spreads fast. About 2 weeks after I found residents standing on my dock, Silverglass Shores held a community meeting at their clubhouse. I was not invited. That alone told me plenty. A retired school principal named Walter Jenkins called me afterward and asked if we could meet for coffee. Walter lived inside the subdivision and seemed like a decent man. We met at a small diner near the highway the next morning. He looked uncomfortable before we even sat down. "Everett, I think you need to know what is being said." I listened. Walter explained that Maribel had spent nearly an hour presenting plans for future lake amenities. She showed slides. She showed maps. She talked about protecting property values. She talked about expanding recreational opportunities. Then she displayed a photograph of my shoreline on a projector screen in front of the entire room. Not a concept drawing. Not a proposal. A photograph of my actual property. Walter said several people assumed ownership issues had already been resolved because of how confidently everything was presented. That was not an accident. Confidence sells. Facts do not always keep up. Things got worse from there. A few days later, I started hearing from residents directly. One couple from Ohio stopped me at a gas station. They told me they paid nearly $90,000 extra for a premium lot because the sales presentation emphasized future access to waterfront facilities. Another homeowner said he chose Silverglass Shores specifically because brochures highlighted private lake activities. A widow named Donna Mercer told me she had invested part of her retirement savings into the neighborhood because she believed the promised amenities would increase long-term value. Every conversation sounded slightly different. Every conversation pointed to the same problem. Somebody had been making promises. Then the HOA board introduced what they called a Lake Access Reserve Fund. The official explanation was that the money would support future shoreline improvements and community lake projects. Residents received notices requesting additional dues. Some paid immediately. Others asked questions. Questions did not seem welcome. Walter later told me board meetings were becoming tense. Homeowners who asked for documentation were brushed aside. Residents who wanted details were told negotiations were ongoing. Negotiations. That word kept appearing. The only problem was nobody had ever negotiated with me. Not once. Around the same time, I started finding strange things around the property. New directional signs appeared near the subdivision pointing toward the waterfront. Social media posts described the shoreline as a future community gathering area. One local real estate advertisement even mentioned planned lake access opportunities within walking distance. The language was careful, just careful enough. It implied ownership without directly claiming it. That was deliberate. One afternoon, I received a phone call from a veteran named Earl Dawson who lived inside Silverglass Shores. Earl had spent 22 years in the Army and did not have much patience for nonsense. "Everett," he said, "I think they are feeding us a story." I asked why he felt that way. His answer was simple. Because every time somebody asks for paperwork, they get another speech instead. That stuck with me. In law enforcement, paperwork matters. In property law, paperwork matters even more. Deeds matter. Surveys matter. Recorded easements matter. Opinions do not. A week later, Earl called again. This time he sounded irritated. He had received a warning letter from the HOA after questioning the reserve fund during a meeting. Another homeowner received a violation notice for posting concerns in the community forum. A retired couple was threatened with penalties after refusing to support a special assessment. Suddenly, this was no longer just about my land. The same tactics being aimed at me were now being aimed at the people living inside the subdivision. Maribel was creating two groups: people who agreed with her and people she considered obstacles. That strategy works for a while, until evidence starts showing up. And evidence was finally beginning to appear. Once evidence starts appearing, people usually make one of two choices. They either slow down and correct course, or they panic and double down. Maribel chose the second option. Looking back, that was probably the moment this stopped being a neighborhood disagreement and started becoming a legal problem. A few days after Earl called me, I drove into town and spent most of the morning at the county records office. The building was not impressive. Old brick walls, fluorescent lights, stacks of records stretching back decades. But if you want the truth about property ownership, that is where you go. Not social media, not HOA newsletters, not sales brochures. The county records office does not care about opinions. It cares about documents. I like that. The clerk behind the counter knew me from years ago and pointed me toward the property archives. By lunchtime, I had copies of every document connected to Whitaker Point and Silverglass Shores. Deeds, surveys, plat maps, easements, tax records, development filings, everything. The picture became clear very quickly. My property boundaries had never changed. Not once. There were no recorded easements granting access to my shoreline. There were no agreements allowing community use of the dock. There were no filings transferring ownership rights. Nothing. The paperwork was crystal clear. Silverglass Shores had exactly zero legal claim to my property. That should have been the end of it. It was not. While reviewing development documents, I noticed something odd. Several marketing materials referenced waterfront lifestyle features that seemed suspiciously familiar. The wording was careful enough to avoid direct claims, but the implication was obvious. Buyers were being encouraged to believe future access was coming. The more documents I read, the worse it looked. So I called somebody whose opinion I trusted. Her name was Eleonora Pike. Most people in 3 counties simply called her Nora. She was 67 years old, sharp as a razor blade, and had spent nearly 4 decades handling title disputes and property law. When Nora walked into a room carrying a legal file, people usually became much more honest. I met her the following afternoon. She spent nearly an hour reviewing the records without saying much. Then she removed her reading glasses and looked directly at me. Everett, these people do not have a property problem. I asked what she meant. She tapped the stack of documents. They have a documentation problem. That got my attention. Nora explained that ownership was not ambiguous. The county records were clear. The surveys were clear. The tax history was clear. The issue was that someone appeared to be presenting expectations to homeowners that were unsupported by recorded property rights. In plain English, promises were being made without paperwork backing them up. That is dangerous, especially when money is involved. Before leaving, Nora gave me one piece of advice. Do not argue with them. I smiled. I was not planning to. She nodded. Good. Let them keep talking. Smart advice. Over the next 2 weeks, I started paying closer attention. Residents continued sharing information. Copies of HOA emails found their way into my mailbox. Flyers appeared. Meeting summaries appeared. Internal announcements appeared. One document described future shoreline integration opportunities. Another mentioned anticipated recreational access enhancements. Yet another discussed protecting planned lake amenities for homeowners. Every document danced around the same idea without ever stating it directly. It was like watching somebody build a bridge out of fog. Then something unexpected landed in my hands. A homeowner forwarded me screenshots from an HOA planning group. Buried inside a discussion thread was a message from the subdivision treasurer. The message was short, very short, but it stopped me cold. The treasurer had written that the waterfront property issue remained unresolved and that access rights had not yet been secured. Not yet secured. In other words, they knew. At least some people inside the HOA knew they did not actually control the property. Yet residents were still paying into special funds connected to future lake projects. That changed everything. Suddenly, this was not about assumptions anymore. It was about knowledge. Somebody knew the truth and kept moving forward anyway. That same evening, I sat on Claire's old porch swing, watching the sun disappear across the lake. The air smelled like pine trees and fresh rain. Boats drifted quietly across the water. Everything looked peaceful, but appearances can fool people. I had spent 34 years investigating situations where the first story turned out to be false. This one felt familiar. Very familiar. The more records I gathered, the less interested I became in winning an argument. Arguments come and go. Evidence stays forever. And somewhere inside Silverglass Shores, somebody was leaving a trail of evidence behind them. The funny thing about people who think they are winning is that they usually become careless. Careful people hide things. Confident people leave doors open. And Maribel was becoming very confident. The evidence trail that had started as a few confusing emails slowly turned into something much bigger. It happened one piece at a time. A forwarded message here. A screenshot there. A casual conversation that revealed more than the person intended. Before long, I was seeing a pattern. And once you see a pattern, it is hard to unsee it. About 3 weeks after my meeting with Nora, I received a call from Walter Jenkins. His voice sounded nervous. Not scared. Nervous. There is a difference. Everett, I think you should see something. We met at his house that evening. Walter closed the door behind me, walked into his home office, and pulled out a folder. Inside were printed copies of HOA planning documents that had been distributed to a small committee. Most of it looked ordinary at first. Budgets, landscaping proposals, maintenance discussions. Then I found a page labeled Future Community Waterfront Integration Strategy. That title alone made me pause. The document described potential access pathways, shoreline activities, community boating programs, and waterfront gathering areas. Every single item depended on property the HOA did not own. That was bad. Then it got worse. Buried near the bottom was a sentence that caught my eye immediately. It stated that certain ownership issues were expected to be resolved through ongoing pressure and negotiations. Pressure. Not purchase. Not agreement. Pressure. I read that line 3 times. Walter shook his head. I do not think most homeowners ever saw this version. I believed him. Most people would have objected immediately. The next clue arrived from somewhere even more unexpected. Earl Dawson called me one afternoon and asked if I wanted to take a drive. 20 minutes later, we were parked near a model home at the edge of Silverglass Shores. Earl pointed toward a large display board used during sales tours. Families were walking through open houses. Real estate agents were giving presentations. Everything looked perfectly normal. Until I started listening. One sales representative was explaining the advantages of living in the subdivision. Property values, community events, waterfront experiences. Then she pointed toward a photograph hanging on the wall. My dock. Again, not a similar dock. Not a stock image. My actual dock. Future recreational opportunities are expected to expand as community plans move forward, she told a couple standing nearby. She never directly claimed ownership. She did not have to. The implication did the work for her. That was the trick. The more I watched, the clearer it became. Nobody was making one giant false statement. Instead, dozens of small suggestions were being repeated until buyers accepted them as fact. Smart, but dangerous. A few days later, another piece of the puzzle appeared. This time it came from inside the HOA board itself. The treasurer resigned. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. Rumors spread quickly through the neighborhood. Some people blamed health issues. Others blamed stress. The truth came out during a conversation with Walter. Apparently, the treasurer had repeatedly questioned how reserve fund money was being collected and described. According to Walter, several meetings became heated after requests for supporting documentation were ignored. That caught my attention. Money always leaves footprints. The same week, Maribel started escalating her behavior toward me. More notices appeared on my gate. More emails arrived claiming noncompliance. More references to community authority showed up in official communications. She seemed convinced that if she generated enough paperwork, ownership itself would somehow change. It does not work that way. Property law is stubborn. Then came the moment I knew she had crossed a line she could not uncross. A homeowner forwarded me part of an internal email chain discussing future resident access. One board member directly asked whether legal rights had been secured. Maribel's response was short. Very short. Not yet, but resistance is weakening. Resistance. That was me. She was talking about me. Not as a property owner. Not as a neighbor. As an obstacle. I sat at my kitchen table staring at those words while the evening sun faded outside the window. Claire used to say that sooner or later people reveal who they really are. Sometimes they do it through actions. Sometimes they do it through words. Maribel had just done both. And she still thought nobody could see it. That was her biggest mistake. Because by then I was no longer collecting random documents. I was building a timeline. And every new piece of evidence fit perfectly into place. The night everything finally came apart, was the same night Maribel thought she had complete control. Silverglass Shores had scheduled a special community meeting at the clubhouse, and according to the notice sent to residents, the purpose was to address ongoing compliance concerns and protect community interests. That sounded official. It also sounded vague. By then, almost every homeowner in the subdivision had heard some version of the story. Some believed Maribel completely. Some were starting to have doubts. Most were simply confused. Confusion was about to disappear. The clubhouse was packed when I arrived. Folding chairs filled every corner of the room. Homeowners lined the walls holding coffee cups and notepads. A projector screen displayed slides about community values and future planning. The atmosphere felt less like a neighborhood meeting and more like a campaign rally. Maribel loved that. She stood near the front wearing a confident smile while greeting residents one by one. Every movement suggested she already knew how the evening would end. She did not. The meeting started with routine business. Landscaping updates, budget summaries, maintenance reports. Then Maribel shifted the conversation toward what she called unresolved waterfront issues. My name appeared on the screen behind her. Several people turned to look at me. I remained seated. That seemed to bother her. She spent nearly 20 minutes describing resistance, delays, and obstacles preventing the community from reaching its full potential. She never mentioned deeds. She never mentioned surveys. She never mentioned ownership. Those details were missing for a reason. Facts are inconvenient when they point the wrong direction. Then came her biggest mistake. She announced that immediate action was necessary to protect homeowners from continued interference. Her voice became louder. Her gestures became sharper. She pointed toward me and said, "Certain individuals continue refusing lawful community authority despite repeated requests." A few people nodded. Others exchanged uneasy looks. Walter looked down at the floor. Earl folded his arms. Donna Mercer stared directly at Maribel with a frown. The room was changing. Maribel either did not notice or did not care. Then she picked up her phone. "I have already contacted law enforcement, so this matter can be addressed properly tonight." A few gasps moved through the room. That got everyone's attention. Mine too, because I knew exactly who was coming. 10 minutes later, the clubhouse doors opened, and Deputy Nolan Price walked inside. The room immediately fell silent. Maribel looked relieved. She actually smiled. That smile lasted about 30 seconds. Nolan approached the front of the room and listened while Maribel explained her version of events. She spoke confidently. She spoke quickly. She described HOA authority. She described noncompliance. She described community rights. She even handed him a neatly organized folder she called her enforcement packet. Nolan accepted it without comment. Then he opened it. The room waited. He flipped through the pages one by one. Notices, HOA policies, committee reports, meeting summaries. Plenty of paper. Very little ownership. Finally, he looked up. "Do you have a recorded deed showing HOA ownership of the property in question?" The room became very quiet. Maribel blinked. "The community has established interests." Nolan asked again. "Do you have a deed?" She started talking about future plans. He asked about easements. She talked about community expectations. He asked about recorded access rights. She changed the subject. People were starting to notice. Then I stood up and walked toward the front carrying a plain manila envelope. No speeches. No dramatic gestures. Just paperwork. I handed the envelope to Nolan. Inside were certified copies of the deed, tax records, surveys, county plats, title history, and easement records. Everything. He reviewed them carefully. Then he looked at the audience. "For clarification," he said, "the property discussed tonight is privately owned. The records provided by the county show no HOA ownership, no HOA easement, and no HOA access rights." You could almost hear the air leave the room. Several homeowners turned toward Maribel at the exact same time. Others began flipping through meeting packets searching for answers. Earl actually laughed. Not loudly, just enough. Then Nolan pulled out another document. The call log. He calmly explained that previous complaints had described the owner as an unlawful occupant and trespasser. That statement did not match county records. It did not match title records. It did not match reality. The silence became uncomfortable. Maribel looked stunned. For the first time since I met her, she seemed unsure what to say next. The story she had spent months building was collapsing in front of everyone. And the worst part for her was that nobody had attacked it. The facts had done all the work. What happened after that meeting was far more important than the meeting itself. A lot of people think justice happens in one dramatic moment. Most of the time it does not. Most of the time the truth shows up first, and the consequences arrive later. That is exactly what happened here. The morning after the clubhouse meeting, Silverglass Shores felt like a completely different neighborhood. Homeowners who had spent months trusting board updates were suddenly asking questions. Residents wanted documents. Residents wanted receipts. Residents wanted explanations. And for the first time, nobody seemed interested in speeches. They wanted proof. That changed everything. Within a week, several homeowners formally requested financial records connected to the Lake Access Reserve Fund. Others demanded copies of meeting minutes and planning documents. The board members who had quietly followed Maribel's lead suddenly found themselves answering uncomfortable questions. Walter told me attendance at HOA meetings doubled almost overnight. People who had never spoken before started speaking. People who had never challenged anything started reading every page. Funny how that works. Once people learn the value of documentation, they rarely go back. The reserve fund was eventually frozen pending review. Then came the next surprise. An independent audit requested by residents found that money collected for future lake projects had been tied to assumptions that were never supported by recorded property rights. The findings spread through the neighborhood fast. Homeowners were angry, not because they lost money, because they felt misled. Trust is hard to earn, easy to lose. Around the same time, several real estate disclosures and marketing materials connected to the subdivision were updated. References to future waterfront opportunities quietly disappeared. Brochures changed. Sales presentations changed. Website language changed. Nobody admitted why. They did not need to. Everyone already knew. The truth had become impossible to ignore. As for Maribel, her influence disappeared much faster than it had appeared. She resigned from her leadership position before the end of the season. Some people said she was overwhelmed. Others said she saw what was coming and stepped aside. I honestly do not know. What I do know is that the confidence she carried into that clubhouse never returned. Actions have consequences, even when they arrive slowly. The county also reviewed several complaints and reports connected to the situation. Because some filings and statements conflicted with documented property records, additional administrative reviews followed. I will leave it at that. The important point is simple. Official reports matter. Accuracy matters. Facts matter, especially when government resources are involved. Meanwhile, life at Whitaker Point returned to something resembling normal. The signs disappeared. The surprise visitors stopped. The golf carts stopped appearing near the gate. The rumors faded. The noise finally settled down. Peace came back. One Saturday morning, nearly a year after everything began, I hosted a small gathering at the local library. Nothing fancy, just coffee, donuts, and a workshop explaining deeds, surveys, easements, and property records. More than 40 people showed up. Retirees, veterans, young families, even a few residents from Silverglass Shores. We spent 2 hours talking about how property ownership actually works and where public records can be found. Claire would have loved that. She always believed knowledge solved more problems than anger ever could. Later that evening, I sat on the old dock watching the sun sink behind the trees. The water was calm. The air smelled like pine and lake water. Somewhere across the shoreline, a boat engine hummed softly before fading into the distance. Everything felt familiar again, the way it was supposed to. I looked at the empty chair where Claire used to sit and thought about how close all of this came to ending differently. If there is one lesson in this story, it is not about winning. It is about patience. It is about keeping records. It is about understanding your rights before someone else tells you what they are. People can argue with opinions all day long. They can ignore rumors. They can dismiss emotions. But paperwork has a funny way of making loud people quiet. And in the end, that is exactly what happened.